She left home for $2 and a 1-mile ride and vanished forever. In March of 1974, 17-year-old Amy Billig stepped into the afternoon sun of Coconut Grove, Florida. Witnesses saw her at the roadside. She was never seen again. More than 3 decades later, her mother held a memorial without a body, after a confession that answered nothing. How does someone disappear in broad daylight in their own neighborhood? And where did you first hear about Amy Billig's story? Coconut Grove in 1974 was not yet the upscale enclave it would become. It was an artistic haven tucked into Miami's sprawl, a bohemian community where painters displayed their work on sidewalk easels and musicians gathered in parks with guitars balanced on their knees. Nathaniel Solomon Billig, friends called him Ned, was a quiet man in his mid-40s who spoke more fluently through paintings and sculptures than through words. His gallery on Commodore Plaza showcased local artists, dreamers, and professionals alike, anyone whose work showed genuine vision. He was the kind of father who said yes, easily, who believed in his children's independence, who never imagined that agreeing to lend $2 could be the last conversation he would have with his daughter for the rest of his life. Susan Billig, in her early 40s, carried herself with the determined elegance of someone who had fought for everything she valued. An interior designer and art dealer, she approached problems with the conviction that solutions existed if you worked hard enough, searched long enough, refused to surrender. She had endured 4 miscarriages before Amy was born, 4 losses that had taught her both the fragility of life and the fierce protectiveness that comes from nearly losing something precious. When she looked at Amy, she would think, "What did I do to deserve such a beautiful thing?" That gratitude would later transform into a promise she could not break, even when breaking it might have saved her. Amy Billig was 17 that spring, standing 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighing 110 pounds with waist-length brown hair that caught light like polished wood. Her eyes were brown and gentle, the kind that seemed to notice beauty in ordinary things, the way morning sun filtered through palm fronds, the pattern of waves breaking against the shore. Teachers at Adelphi Academy of Coral Gables described her as creative and present, a student who engaged fully with ideas. Friends knew her as a flower child, a girl whose soul belonged to an earlier, more innocent time. She played flute and guitar, wrote poetry and notebooks. She kept private trained dolphins at the Miami Seaquarium with a patience that amazed her supervisors. The family shared rituals that bound them together. Friday night dinners around the Shabbat candles. Susan and Amy trading clothes from each other's closets, the mother borrowing the daughter's peasant blouses, the daughter stealing the mother's silk scarves. Joshua, 16 and quieter than his sister, watched his family with the observant distance of someone who processed the world internally. They were involved in community cultural organizations, attended gallery openings and concerts, believed in the power of art to transform ordinary existence into something meaningful. It was a household where emotions were discussed openly, where independence was encouraged, where making your own decisions, even about transportation, was considered part of growing up. Tuesday, March 5, 1974, began like any other. The morning arrived with that Florida brightness that seems to erase shadows, the air already warming toward afternoon heat. Amy attended her classes at Adelphi Academy just 21 days from her graduation ceremony scheduled for March 31st. Nothing about her demeanor suggested anything unusual. She participated in discussions, laughed with friends, made plans for lunch later that day. When classes ended near noon, she headed home to the house on South Grove, the route so familiar she could have walked it blindfolded. She arrived home in the early afternoon, the house quiet around her. Her bedroom remained exactly as she had decorated it. Posters on the walls, musical instruments resting in corners, poetry notebooks stacked on her desk. She went to the kitchen and ate yogurt, the kind of healthy snack a vegetarian teenager would choose. Years later, Susan would remember this detail with crystalline clarity, the yogurt, while struggling to recall what they had talked about, whether they had even spoken at all. Some memories brand themselves into our minds, while others slip away like smoke, and we never know which will be which until it is too late. Amy picked up the telephone and dialed her father's gallery. The conversation was comfortable, transactional, the kind that happens between people who expect to see each other in 20 minutes. "Dad, can I borrow $2 for lunch?" She and her friends were meeting at Peacock Park and she needed lunch money. Nathaniel agreed without hesitation. Of course. Come by the gallery anytime. He would be there. She could pick up the money and head to the park. Amy decided the blouse she had worn to school was not quite right for an afternoon with friends. She changed into something else, the exact garment lost to memory now, though Susan would spend years trying to remember. A denim miniskirt, that much was certain. Cork platform sandals with their distinctive thick soles, and a blouse that seemed more appropriate for a casual afternoon in the park. On her way out, she grabbed her Instamatic camera. Perhaps she planned to take photos at lunch. Perhaps she had taken photos earlier that her parents never saw. The camera would become the only physical evidence of her disappearance, and its secrets would remain locked in overexposed film and unanswerable questions. It was approximately 1:15 in the afternoon when Amy stepped out of her house and began walking toward her father's gallery on Commodore Plaza. The distance was less than 1 mile. The route took her along familiar streets past houses she had passed hundreds of times. She could have walked the entire way 20 minutes at most, but hitchhiking was faster, and in 1974, Coconut Grove, it was normal. Neighbors gave neighbors rides. It was community, not danger. It was trust made visible. Construction workers at the corner of Poinciana Street and Main Highway saw her standing with her thumb extended. They noticed her because she was young and pretty, because her brown hair fell to her waist in waves, because she stood there in her platform sandals looking like countless other teenagers of that era, independent, hopeful, unafraid. They did not note which direction she was facing. They did not record how long she stood there. They did not see which vehicle stopped, who was driving, whether Amy hesitated before opening the door. They were working, and she was just another girl hitchhiking, an image so common it barely registered. That was the last time anyone saw Amy Billig. Somewhere between 1:15 and 2 o'clock that afternoon, in the span of less than 45 minutes, in the bright daylight of a Tuesday in March, Amy Billig got into a vehicle and vanished. The space she was supposed to occupy, her father's gallery, Peacock Park, the lunch table with her friends, remained empty. By 2:30, her friends were calling the Billig house asking Susan why Amy had not shown up. The question seemed minor at first, the kind of small confusion that has a simple explanation. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she got distracted. Maybe she was running late. Susan assured them Amy would be along soon. She had left the house more than an hour ago. But as the afternoon stretched on, and Amy's friends called again, concern began its slow creep into Susan's chest. When Nathaniel came home that evening, he brought news that transformed concern into panic. Amy had never arrived at his gallery. She had never picked up the $2. She had never been there at all. Susan tried to reconstruct the afternoon. Amy had called around 1 o'clock. She had left shortly after. She should have reached the gallery by 1:30 at the latest. Where had she been for the past 6 hours? Susan moved through the house, calling Amy's name as if her daughter might somehow be hiding in her bedroom, in the bathroom somewhere, with a reasonable explanation. She checked Amy's room for signs of planning. Had she packed a bag? Had she taken extra clothes? Everything sat exactly as Amy had left it. Her belongings untouched. Her diary still on her desk. Nothing suggested she had intended to go anywhere except to her father's gallery and then to lunch with friends. Susan called Amy's friends again, asking each one if they had seen her, if she had mentioned other plans, if anything had seemed wrong. No one knew anything. They had been waiting at Peacock Park. Amy had never arrived. Susan called neighbors asking if anyone had seen Amy walking, had given her a ride, had noticed anything unusual. No one had. The construction workers who had seen her hitchhiking were not identified until later, and even then their information provided nothing useful, just a girl standing at a corner, a scene they had witnessed 1,000 times before. By evening, Susan called the Miami Police Department. A detective named Michael Gonzalez took the call. His response would echo in Susan's mind for the rest of her life. "Don't panic," he told her. "Call back if Amy isn't home by morning." The assumption was clear. Teenage girl, no sign of foul play, probably just a runaway. Come back when it becomes a real problem. Susan did not sleep that night. She sat by the telephone, jumping at every sound, hoping for Amy's key in the lock, her footsteps on the porch, her voice calling out with some sheepish explanation. Joshua sat with her for hours, then retreated to his room where worry and confusion warred with the helpless feeling of being 16 and unable to fix anything. Nathaniel Pace drove the route between their house and his gallery multiple times, searched the streets looking for any sign of his daughter. The night passed with excruciating slowness, each hour marked by the certainty that something was terribly wrong. At 6 o'clock on the morning of March 6th, Susan called the Miami Police Department again. This time they listened. This time an investigation was launched. By the time the first patrol cars arrived at the Billig house, Amy had been missing for approximately 17 hours. In 17 hours, a person can drive from Miami to Atlanta. They can cross state lines, change identities, disappear into America's vast interior. Susan did not know this yet, but she was learning. And she would spend the next 31 years measuring time not in hours but in the distance between hope and despair. The Miami Police Department mobilized quickly once they understood this was not a simple runaway case. Detectives interviewed the family, taking detailed descriptions of Amy, what she had been wearing, where she was going, who might have seen her. They questioned Amy's classmates at Adelphi Academy, her teachers, anyone who had interacted with her in the days before her disappearance. They searched Peacock Park, the route between the Billig house and Nathaniel's gallery, every location Amy was known to frequent. They found nothing. Within 24 hours, the search expanded dramatically. Volunteers from the community joined police in grid searches of the neighborhood. Hundreds of people combed through yards, parks, wooded areas, anywhere a person might be hidden or might have wandered. Search dogs were brought in, but without a clear scent trail. Amy had gotten into a vehicle, not walked away. The dogs had nothing to follow. The searches yielded no torn clothing, no signs of struggle, no abandoned belongings. It was as if Amy had simply evaporated. Susan and Nathaniel threw themselves into the search with the desperation of parents who cannot sit still while their child is missing. They hired a private investigator, though he would develop no conclusive leads. They printed hundreds of missing persons posters featuring Amy's school photo, her description, the family's phone number. These posters appeared on telephone poles throughout Miami-Dade County, in shop windows, on community bulletin boards. Susan and volunteers distributed bilingual flyers, English and Spanish, door-to-door, and in public locations throughout South Florida. Recognizing that in Miami's diverse community, information might come from anyone, the family established a vigil whereby someone, usually Susan, remained close to the telephone at all times. If Amy called, someone would be there to answer. If her abductors made contact, someone would be ready. The phone became both a source of hope and an instrument of torture, each ring bringing the possibility of news, each wrong number, another crushing disappointment. 5 days after Amy's disappearance on March 10th, the first newspaper headline appeared in local periodicals. The coverage revealed that both police and Amy's family suspected kidnapping, possibly by members of a motorcycle gang. That same evening, a benefit concert raised $850 for search expenses, and a fund was established at a local bank to help finance the investigation. A reward of $1,000 was offered for information leading to Amy's whereabouts. Within weeks, donations poured in from friends, neighbors, colleagues, former neighbors from New York. Amy's high school organized a music festival that raised $1,500. The community was rallying, but money could not buy the one thing the Billigs needed: their daughter's location. Tips began coming in almost immediately, dozens per day in the first week. Most were well-meaning but unhelpful. Someone thought they saw a girl who looked like Amy at a shopping mall, at a beach, in a restaurant. Each tip was investigated. Each one led nowhere. Some tips were crueler. Anonymous callers claimed to have information but wanted money first, or claimed to be holding Amy themselves, or simply wanted to hear a mother's desperation on the other end of the line. Susan took every call, no matter how suspicious, because any one of them might be real. Our community knows this terror: the phone call that does not come, the door that does not open, the ordinary Tuesday that becomes the before and after line in a family's history. We know how search parties form from strangers who become family, how neighbors bring food that will not be eaten, how hope and dread can live in the same heartbeat. We know that in those first days, everyone still believes in the possibility of a simple explanation of a happy ending. The mother still expects her daughter to walk through the door with an apologetic smile. The investigators still believe the next tip will be the one. Everyone is still looking forward, not yet understanding they will be looking backward for decades. The sole piece of physical evidence in Amy's disappearance surfaced on March 18th, 13 days after she vanished. A hitchhiking college student found Amy's Instamatic camera lying in the grass beside the Wildwood exit on Florida's Turnpike, approximately 250 miles northwest of Miami. The camera bore Amy's name. Processing of the film inside yielded mostly overexposed photographs damaged by heat and sun and time, but a few images remained visible. One showed a light-colored pickup truck parked in front of a vine-covered building. Another depicted a white van. Investigators studied these photographs for clues. Where was this building? Who owned these vehicles? When had Amy taken these photos? None of these questions were ever answered. The vehicles were never identified. The building was never located. The camera raised more questions than it answered, and its discovery, 250 miles north, raised the most troubling question of all. If Amy had been taken by motorcycle gangs heading to Daytona Beach for Bike Week, why was her camera found northwest, in the opposite direction, both police and Susan began receiving tips pointing toward motorcycle gangs. Two rival organizations, the Outlaws Motorcycle Club and the Pagans Motorcycle Club, had both traveled through the Coconut Grove area on March 5th, heading to their annual gathering in Daytona. Both gangs had reputations for violence against women, for abduction and assault, for treating females as property to be used and discarded. The theory began to solidify. Amy had been picked up by members of one of these gangs, taken somewhere, and was being held against her will. On March 16th, a caller identifying herself as Susan Johnson told police that Amy had been abducted by the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. Shortly after, a family friend contacted the Billigs with information from a lawyer who had previously represented the Outlaws. Rumors were circulating within the organization about a teenage girl recently taken from Miami. At Susan's request and with the lawyer's help, two members of the Outlaws actually visited the Billig household. Susan pleaded with them for her daughter's return. One of the bikers assured her, "If Amy is in the Outlaw Nation, we'll return her." Days later, he called back with different advice. Forget the whole thing. 16 days after Amy's disappearance, the Billig family received a phone call demanding $30,000 in ransom. The caller claimed to be holding Amy. Susan, desperate and willing to do anything, borrowed the money from friends. A second call came, and Susan heard what she believed was Amy's voice saying, "Mama, Mama, please." Those three words shattered what remained of Susan's composure. A meeting was arranged at the Fontainebleau Hotel on March 22nd for Susan to deliver the money in a black attaché case. But Susan, even in her desperation, insisted on proof. She would not hand over the money until the caller could prove he had Amy. When he could not, police arrested him. The perpetrators turned out to be 16-year-old twin brothers Charles and Lawrence Glasser, who had no involvement in Amy's actual disappearance. They had simply seen an opportunity to exploit a grieving family and had taken it. Both pleaded guilty to extortion. Judge William Gladstone, before sentencing them, stated they had a long way to come back from the serious, delinquent, and tragic events which they caused. After their arrest, Susan addressed the media, her voice shaking with exhaustion and anger. "Please, no more calls like that one. I would have done anything to get Amy back, begged, borrowed, or stolen." But the calls would continue. In fact, they were only beginning. Within months of Amy's disappearance, the Billig family began receiving phone calls from someone who identified himself as Johnson. This was not the teenage extortionists. This was something darker. The caller described in graphic detail the abuse he claimed to be inflicting on Amy. He said she had been abducted by an organized group, that she was being held captive, that Susan herself would suffer the same fate. In one call, he told Susan her daughter had 2 weeks left to live. In another, he said, he had cut off Amy's tongue. The calls were sporadic, sometimes several in one evening for consecutive days, sometimes months would pass between contacts. They came from payphones, making them difficult to trace. The caller ended each conversation quickly before authorities could track the location. Susan refused to change the family's phone number. What if Amy tried to call home? What if she needed to reach them? So Susan endured the harassment, took every call, engaged with the tormentor in the desperate hope that he might reveal something useful, that the calls could eventually be traced, that he might slip and give away his identity or Amy's location. The toll was devastating. Susan developed sleep deprivation, nausea, seizures from the stress. But she persisted because the alternative, missing the one call that might save Amy, was unthinkable. By June of 1974, 3 months after Amy vanished, Susan received what seemed like a credible lead. A convenience store manager in Orlando contacted her, stating that a young woman he positively identified as Amy had entered his store on several occasions with 2 bikers. She had purchased vegetarian soups. This detail gave Susan hope, because Amy's vegetarian diet had never been released to the media. How would this man know unless he had actually seen Amy? Susan investigated, but by the time she reached Orlando, the bikers and the girl were gone. It became a pattern that would repeat for years, a credible sighting, a rush of hope, crushing disappointment when the trail went cold. As days became weeks and weeks became months, the massive search effort began to wind down. Volunteers returned to their lives. Media attention faded. The case was not closed, but it was no longer urgent news. Susan and Nathaniel found themselves facing a reality they had refused to accept. Amy was not coming home tomorrow, or next week, or perhaps ever. But Susan could not stop, would not stop. By January of 1976, nearly 2 years after Amy's disappearance, Susan's search had extended far beyond Florida. She was operating on the theory that Amy had been abducted by a motorcycle gang and was being moved around the country, possibly brainwashed or drugged into forgetting her identity. A gang member who called himself David contacted Susan directly, claiming he recognized Amy from a newspaper photograph as a girl he had previously owned. He agreed to meet with the Billigs at their home, where he described Amy as timid, submissive, quiet like a mute. Then he described her appendectomy scar, a 2-inch mark on her abdomen that had never been disclosed publicly. Susan believed him. David promised to locate Amy and return her to her mother. Susan, allowing herself to hope again, purchased new linens for Amy's bedroom, which she had kept exactly as her daughter had left it. She traveled to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where David had arranged a meeting at a tavern. He claimed Amy would be there. But when Susan arrived, a fight broke out between David and other gang members. He was beaten. Another biker rushed Susan into a taxi for her safety. 5 weeks later, David called one final time. His kneecaps had been broken, likely retaliation for being an informant. He told Susan that Amy was now in Seattle working in a club. Then he said she would never hear from him again. She never did. Susan traveled to Seattle searching venues where young women worked, showing Amy's photograph to anyone who would look. She found nothing. The pattern continued. Tips would come from gang members or their associates, placing Amy in different states: Washington, Nevada, Oklahoma. Susan would travel, investigate, find nothing concrete. Each journey cost money the family no longer had. Susan and Nathaniel closed their art gallery. They sold possessions. They moved to a smaller home. Every dollar went to the search. The harassment from Johnson continued. Throughout these years, a constant background of psychological torture. By 1992, 18 years after Amy's disappearance, Susan was diagnosed with lung cancer. When she told the caller about her diagnosis, hoping it might touch some fragment of conscience in him, he instead incorporated this information into his threats and taunts. The cruelty was boundless. In 1993, 19 years after losing Amy, Nathaniel Billig died of lung cancer. His final words expressed his desire to see his daughter before he died. He never got that chance. Susan continued alone, supported by Joshua, now an adult, who had spent his entire adolescence and young adulthood watching his mother search for a sister he barely remembered. Our community knows that searching can become identity. Without the search, who was Susan? The mother who gave up, the woman who betrayed her promise. She had told Amy in her heart that she would find her, and she could not break that promise, even when the promise was destroying her health, her finances, her remaining relationships. She had stated publicly in 1984, 10 years into the search, "Every day I think that tomorrow I'm going to find her. If she's alive, she knows I'm going to find her. I have made a promise to Amy in my heart. I must find her." That promise became both her purpose and her prison. Then, in October of 1995, 21 years after Amy vanished, something changed. The FBI successfully traced a cellular phone call from Johnson. Technology had finally caught up with the tormentor. The cellular phone was registered to a 48-year-old man named Henry Johnson Blair, a married father of 2 daughters who had worked for the United States Customs Service for 24 years. A federal agent. The same law enforcement system that had failed to find Amy Billig had been harboring her tormentor. FBI agents arrested Blair and charged him with 3 counts of aggravated stalking. He was released on $75,000 bond to await trial. But Blair's arrest opened questions that went far beyond harassment. Detectives reviewing Amy's case file noticed something they had not connected before. In Amy's diary, preserved as evidence, she had written an entry 6 weeks before her disappearance about a man she called Hank. This man had asked her to accompany him to South America. Amy had written that she told him he is crazy. Henry Blair's nickname was Hank. His job with U.S. Customs required temporary relocation to South America in early 1974. matching the timeline of Amy's diary entry. And Blair owned a white van in 1974, similar to the white van photographed on Amy's camera film. Was Blair more than just a stalker? Had he known Amy before her disappearance? Was he involved in her abduction? These questions consumed the investigation, but answers proved elusive. At his trial in March of 1996, Blair pleaded not guilty to aggravated stalking. He was convicted of 2 counts of stalking and sentenced to 2 years in prison. During the trial, he admitted to obtaining a form of gratification from making the calls, but insisted he had never met Amy and knew nothing about her disappearance. He claimed to be an alcoholic with obsessive-compulsive disorder and thus not responsible for his actions. Susan later settled a $5 million civil lawsuit against Blair, though he never apologized. The conviction silenced the phone calls, but it could not silence Susan's questions. If Blair was not involved in Amy's disappearance, why had he targeted this specific family for 21 years? Why had he known details about Amy that were never made public? The timing, the van, the South America connection, the diary entry. Were these all coincidences? Investigators could not prove otherwise, and Blair maintained his denial. The question of his involvement remained unresolved. Then, in December of 1997, 23 years after Amy vanished, another piece of the puzzle emerged. Paul Branch, a high-ranking member of the Pagans Motorcycle Club, was dying in Charlottesville, Virginia. He had been questioned multiple times over the years about missing girls and unsolved crimes. He had always denied knowledge. He had even spoken personally with Ned and Susan Billig, looked them in the eyes, and claimed he knew nothing. But facing death, Paul Branch told his wife a story he had carried for more than 2 decades. According to Branch's confession given to his wife, who later shared it with investigators, Amy Billig had been picked up by members of the Pagans on March 5, 1974. They took her to a party at a trailer clubhouse the gang operated in the Everglades. At this party, Amy said something that insulted some of the members. What followed was horror beyond comprehension. Approximately 24 gang members assaulted her. When she fought back, they injected her with substances to subdue her. They held her down and continued the attack. Eventually, she died from an overdose of the substances they had forced into her body. Her body was disposed of in the swamp hastily and in panic because her passing had not been their intention. They had meant to assault her and let her go or keep her for a while, but her ending complicated everything. So they eliminated the evidence and went on to Daytona, pretending nothing had happened. Branch named one participant in Amy's assault, a man who was already serving time for an unrelated incident since May of 1974. Investigators interviewed him. He denied everything. Branch himself died shortly after making his confession, taking any additional details to the grave. His wife's account could not be verified. No other gang members came forward. No physical evidence could be recovered from the Everglades after 23 years of decay in wildlife and water. Detective Jack Calvar, who had been the lead investigator on Amy's case for years, reviewed Branch's confession carefully. He confirmed that numerous details matched facts of the case that had never been publicly disclosed. Specifics about Amy's clothing, the timeline of gang movement through Florida, methods of disposal that would explain why no body was B's ever recovered. But Calver also added a crucial caveat: we will never find a body. The Everglades span 1.5 million acres. After 2 decades, recovery was impossible. Susan Billig was 72 years old when she learned of Branch's confession. She had been searching for 23 years. She had buried her husband. She was battling lung cancer. She was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Detective Calvar sat with her and told her what Branch had claimed. Susan asked the questions any mother would ask. Did Amy suffer? How long did it take? Did she call for me? Calvar answered as gently as truth allowed. Susan asked the impossible question, do you believe him? Calvar said yes. He believed Branch was telling what he knew. Whether every detail was accurate, whether other members would tell the same story, he could not say. But yes, he believed Amy had died in the Everglades in 1974 within hours of her abduction. For months, Susan processed this information. She talked to Joshua. She prayed. She consulted the few friends who had stayed by her side through decades of searching, and slowly she came to a decision. By 1998, 24 years after Amy's disappearance, Susan accepted that her daughter was gone. On March 8, 1998, Susan held a memorial service for Amy. Not a funeral, there was no body to bury, but a ceremony to acknowledge loss. To honor life, to begin the process of letting go, she invited friends and acquaintances who had helped in the search. Edna Buchanan, a Miami Herald reporter who had followed the case for decades. Investigators, neighbors, people who had never given up hope alongside her. Susan wore all black, but she was not devastated. She was peaceful. She later described obtaining a tremendous sense of peace from the ceremony. She told her guests to laugh and be merry because Amy would have wanted us to. Edna Buchanan observed, Susan has been through more than any other mother I've ever met in all those years of covering missing children. She looks happier and more relieved than I've seen her look in the last 24 years. The memorial service was not surrender. It was not betrayal. It was a mother giving herself permission to stop searching for a daughter who could not be found and start honoring a daughter who deserved to be remembered for living, not just for vanishing. Susan had spent 24 years keeping a promise. Now she was giving herself permission to rest. But Susan was not finished. She spent the next 7 years making sure Amy was not forgotten. With the help of freelance correspondent Greg Aunapu, she wrote a book detailing her daughter's disappearance and her decades-long search. Without a Trace, The Disappearance of Amy Billig. A Mother's Search for Justice was published in September of 2001 to critical acclaim. The book helped other families whose children were missing. It provided insight to investigators. It became a resource for advocacy organizations. Susan wanted the world to know what happened when a girl vanished and a mother refused to stop searching. In October of 2002, the Amy Billig Meditation Garden was formally dedicated in Coconut Grove off McFarland Road near Peacock Park, where Amy had been planning to meet her friends for lunch 28 years earlier. Joshua designed the stone marker that stands at the garden's entrance, topped with a black plaque. The inscription reads, Amy Billig Meditation Garden, for a beautiful Coconut Grove girl who loved this park. The garden became a place for community healing, not just for Amy, but for all missing persons, all unsolved losses, all mothers who searched. Susan visited the garden frequently in her final years. She sat on the benches Joshua had chosen, felt the Florida sun that Amy had loved, and found the peace that 2 decades of searching had not provided. Her search efforts, though they never found Amy, had helped rescue several other girls and women who had been taken by motorcycle gangs. Survivors contacted Susan to thank her. Her relentless investigation of gang activity had indirectly freed them. This knowledge brought Susan comfort. Amy's disappearance, while never solved, had meaning beyond their family's tragedy. Susan Billig died of a heart attack on June 7, 2005, following her long battle with lung cancer. She was 80 years old. She had outlived her husband by 12 years and had spent 31 years searching for her daughter, longer than Amy had been alive. By the time of her passing, Joshua had given her 2 granddaughters. One resembled Amy so closely it sometimes startled people, a genetic echo of the daughter Susan had lost. 2 days after his mother's death, Joshua reflected on the lifelong impact his sister's disappearance had upon her. I don't think my mother ever found peace. She took that wound right to the grave. But others who had known Susan in her final years disagreed. Those who had attended the 1998 memorial service, who had seen her write the book and create the garden, believed she had found a version of peace. Not the peace of answers, but the peace of having done everything humanly possible and finally being able to rest. She was interred in Miami's Graceland Cemetery. The family requested donations to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Our community knows that mothers do not stop being mothers when their children disappear. Susan Billig was Amy's mother every single day for 31 years. After Amy vanished in her searching, her suffering, her refusal to forget, her ultimate acceptance. She was Amy's mother when she confronted motorcycle gangs and when she endured stalker calls. She was Amy's mother when she held a memorial service without a body, and when she planted a garden without knowing where her daughter's remains lay. She died, Amy's mother. And somewhere in the Everglades, or somewhere beyond this world perhaps, Amy knows that her mother never ever stopped loving her. 51 years have passed since Amy Billig disappeared. If she had lived, she would be 69 years old now, approaching 70. She might be a grandmother herself. She might have become that actress she dreamed of being, or a marine biologist working with dolphins, or a poet publishing verses about nature and beauty. Susan would be 101 years old if she had survived. She died 21 years ago at 80, having searched for 31 years. Nathaniel has been gone for 33 years, having died at 68 without ever knowing what happened to his daughter. Joshua Billig is 68 years old now. The 16-year-old boy who watched his sister vanish is approaching 70 himself. His daughters, Amy's nieces, are adults with lives of their own. One still bears a striking resemblance to the aunt she never met. The Amy Billig Meditation Garden still stands in Coconut Grove, maintained by the city, visited by those who remember and those who are just learning the story. It is a peaceful place born from circumstances that were anything but peaceful. Amy's case file remains officially open with the Miami Police Department. Technically, she could still walk through a door somewhere, could still be found. Practically, the only resolution will come if remains are discovered, and after half a century in the Everglades, that remains unlikely. Detective Calvar's assessment from 1997 still stands: we will never find a body. Amy's case predates many of the systems we rely on today to find missing persons. The Amber Alert system was not launched until 1996, 22 years after Amy disappeared. If it had existed in 1974, would roadblocks have caught the vehicle carrying her away? Would her photograph have reached police departments before the abductors reached the Everglades? The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was not established until 1984, 10 years after Amy vanished. Susan understood its value because she had lived without it, which is why she requested donations to the organization when she died. DNA databases like CODIS were not operational until 1998. Amy's DNA profile was eventually added, but without remains to compare it against, the database offers only potential, not answers. The cellular phone tracking technology that caught Henry Blair in 1995 did not exist when Amy disappeared. In 2024 Forensic Genetic Genealogy, the technology that solved Mary Schlase's 1974 homicide 50 years later, offers new hope for old cases, but it requires biological evidence. Without Amy's remains, even this breakthrough technology cannot help. What Amy Billig's case teaches us about persistence is complicated. Susan Billig demonstrated that love does not obey logic, that a mother's heart will search even when evidence suggests searching is futile. This was not weakness, it was the human spirit refusing to accept the unacceptable. But her story also teaches us that persistence has costs: health, finances, other relationships, quality of life. The question is not whether Susan should have kept searching, but how we as a society can support families so they do not have to choose between searching and surviving. About community vigilance, Amy's case reminds us that the construction workers who saw her hitchhiking did not note the vehicle that stopped. Why would they? In 1974, hitchhiking was normal, unremarkable, but their lack of attention meant the last people to see Amy alive could not help find her. Today, we are more alert, sometimes to the point of anxiety. Amy's case is part of the reason why. Her disappearance helped change how we think about safety, about trust, about the vulnerability of young people we assume are protected by daylight and community. About Truth, Branch's deathbed confession came 23 years after the crime. Truth does not operate on our timeline. Sometimes it emerges only when perpetrators face their own ending, when technology advances enough to catch them, when documents are declassified, when someone finally decides the burden of silence is heavier than the risk of confession. The families who wait for truth often do not live to receive it, as Nathaniel did not. But truth comes nonetheless, even if it brings no comfort, even if it raises more questions than it answers. For those of us who are mothers, grandmothers who have raised children, and know the fierce protectiveness that comes with loving someone so vulnerable, Amy's story asks us to pay attention. If you see a child who rarely goes outside, who never attends school, whose story does not quite make sense, report it. Calling authorities to report a concern is not being intrusive. It is civic responsibility. If you notice an adult who avoids community, who changes their story, whose explanations never quite add up, trust your instincts. In today's world, we have Amber Alerts and surveillance cameras and DNA databases, but if ordinary people think it's probably nothing, technology is meaningless. We can honor Amy's memory by maintaining digital records of our loved ones, photographs, dental records, DNA samples stored safely. We can support organizations that help families of missing persons, understanding that the search does not end when media attention fades. We can refuse to let victims be forgotten because remembering them keeps the cases alive in ways that matter. Susan's persistence, even when it cost her everything, teaches us that some promises are worth keeping even when keeping them breaks us. Amy Billig was not just a case file or a statistic. She was a girl who loved dolphins and poetry and sunshine. She played the flute and trained marine mammals with patience and gentleness. She wrote in journals and dreamed of acting and chose compassion toward all living things. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. She was here. She mattered. She still does. On that Tuesday in March of 1974, a 17-year-old girl with waist-length brown hair stood at the corner of Poinciana Street and Main Highway with her thumb extended toward a Florida sky that promised nothing but an ordinary afternoon. She was traveling 1 mile to borrow $2. She never arrived. Her mother searched for 31 years, spoke with dangerous people, and endured unimaginable harassment, sold everything she owned, sacrificed her health, and never, not for one single day, gave up hope. Until finally, when hope had taken everything it could take, she gave herself permission to let go. And in letting go, she found something. Amy's abductors could never steal peace. 51 years later, the Everglades keep their secrets. The men who took Amy are likely dead now, their crimes known only to themselves, and perhaps to whatever justice awaits beyond this life. Henry Blair, if he is still living, has never spoken the truth about whether he was involved in more than harassment. The white van and the pickup truck in Amy's photographs remain unidentified. The building with the vine-covered wall has never been found. But the Amy Billig Meditation Garden stands in Coconut Grove, a place of beauty created from tragedy, where people can sit beneath the Florida sun and remember a girl who loved this park, who was supposed to meet her friends here for lunch one Tuesday afternoon and never made it. The garden exists because Joshua promised his mother he would never give up. He keeps that promise not by destroying his life as the search destroyed hers, but by making sure Amy's story continues to be told, continues to matter, continues to remind us that behind every missing person's case is a real person who's laughed and dreamed and loved. If this story has reminded you that love endures beyond logic, that persistence has power even when it does not produce the answers we desperately seek, that mothers are fierce beyond measure, remember Susan Billig. Remember that she made a promise to a daughter who vanished, and kept that promise until her last breath. Remember that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually surface, even if it comes too late for those who searched. Remember that the Everglades may have claimed Amy's body, but they could not claim her story. And as long as we tell it, she has not truly disappeared. Let us know where you are tonight as you hear this story, because somewhere another family is still searching, still hoping, still waiting for someone to notice what everyone else has missed. Pay attention to the people around you. Listen to those who cannot speak for themselves. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Because Amy Billig was taken in broad daylight on a street where construction workers stood watching and no one noticed anything unusual until it was too late. We cannot change what happened to her, but we can honor her memory by being the ones who notice, who care, who refuse to look away when something does not seem right. Because in the end, the distance between a girl coming home and a girl vanishing forever can be as small as one person paying attention, one person asking questions, one person refusing to accept that everything is fine when every instinct says it is not. Amy Billig deserved to come home. She deserved to graduate 3 weeks after she disappeared, to become an actress, to continue training dolphins to write poetry and play music, and grow old surrounded by people who loved her. She deserved to become a mother herself, to hold her own children, to watch them grow. She deserved a life. What she got instead was a promise. A mother's promise that she would be found, would be remembered, would matter. Susan Billig kept that promise for 31 years at a cost most of us cannot imagine. And now, 51 years after Amy vanished, we keep that promise too. We remember. We tell her story. We honor the beautiful Coconut Grove girl who loved the park where a garden now grows in her name, and we pay attention. If this story has reminded you that even in the darkest circumstances, love persists and truth eventually finds its way to light, then Amy's story has done what Susan hoped it would. Somewhere tonight a mother is still searching, a family is still hoping, and perhaps someone watching has noticed something, a detail, a memory, a connection that could finally bring them the answers they've waited years to find. Because hope is not foolish. Hope is what kept Susan searching for 31 years. and hope is what will eventually bring other missing children home. If you'd like to hear more true stories like this, stories of persistence, hope, and the search for truth, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these important cases to light, ensuring that the missing are never forgotten. Thank you for listening to Amy's story tonight.